Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
So, Matt, what has caught your eye over the past couple of weeks?
Well, what has caught my eye are sanctions, which, of course, are an issue top of mind for a lot of compliance companies these days. We had two sanctions enforcement cases last week from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, in the Treasury Department, where one was against Harman International, the stereo equipment and audio equipment company. The other was against Interactive Brokers, which is a brokerage firm. And both of them were slapped by OFAC for sanctions violations that happened in the late 2010s into the early 20s. And Tom, what caught my eye was that in both cases, OFAC said the misconduct involved was not necessarily egregious and widespread. Neither of these companies had employees who were selling weapons of mass destruction or making billions of dollars selling into Iran or anything like that. They were selling into Iran and Russia and Cuba and some other countries. We can talk about the specifics momentarily. But in both instances, OFAC said, look, you did self-disclose. That's great. You did cooperate. You did remediate. That's great. The misconduct wasn't necessarily egregious. That's great. But both companies, you really had an under-resourced sanctions compliance program for a long while going up through the periods of misconduct. And that is not cool. And so then came the fines. Harman was fined $1.4 million. Interactive Brokers was fined $11.8 million. They both also had committed to make various compliance program improvements. We can talk about what they are, but given that sanctions enforcement is probably going to only go up in the Trump administration, we should take a look at what were these companies doing? What were they not doing to have a weak sanctions compliance program? And then, what can the rest of us take from that about how you should be thinking through your sanctions compliance program today if you are worried about sanctions risk, which many companies are?
So, Matt, it strikes me that this is almost a clarion call for every company to revisit their trade control policies, literally, no matter how big they are, number one. And number two, Harman, I was about to say Harman Kardon, but Harman certainly had some poor compliance policies, procedures, and efforts in place. Could you maybe go through those for us?
Well, yeah, so I'll start with Harman then and the misconduct that happened there. So Harman had a professional services subsidiary called Harman Professional or Harman Pro. Now, Harman Pro had a wing that was based overseas in Dubai, and it was run by, there was a collection of British nationals who were involved in this. So Harman International would ship its goods to a warehouse in Denmark, at which point Harman Pro would help get those goods into the hands of the distributor in the UAE. And that distributor, we do not know the name of the distributor, then basically sold a lot of those goods into Iran. And the Harman Pro employees, all British nationals working outside the United States, if I'm remembering all of my consent order correctly, they knew this was going on. And they were deliberately obfuscating and fussing around with corporate emails to hide the fact that they knew this distributor in the UAE was sending goods onto Iran. So in the emails, they were referring to up north or Dubai North, and those were really just code words for Iran. The British nationals knew this. They knew the goods were going to Iran. They basically turned a blind eye to it. This went on for a period of 4 or 5 years from, I want to say, 2018 through into mid-2020, if I believe. So total of 3 years plus change. And this wasn't a large amount of money. They weren't shipping billions of dollars worth of goods into Iran, but these goods were going into Iran. The subsidiary knew about it. The subsidiary employees were trying to cover it up. And the issue, the aggravating factor that OFAC flagged with Harman was more that Harman just didn't have a very strong sanctions compliance team at the U.S. to be able to push out its control and oversight over these issues to its overseas units, its overseas subsidiaries, its overseas distributors. None of that was getting caught. And that was the thing that stuck in OFAC's craw here. Like I said, Harman did everything right once they had a falling out with the distributor. Apparently, at some point, they investigated and decided, oops, okay, we have this issue. They've self-disclosed. They worked with OFAC. They've implemented some remediation. That's all nice. But let me see if I can dig up the exact state of affairs for that aggravating factor. Was that they had exactly one sanctions employee to be able to try and run all of this. They also didn't really have much of a good risk assessment process. The Harman people, they didn't conduct their own risk assessment of what were the sanctions issues with our subsidiaries. The business units had to self-disclose that or self-report their own concerns. Well, that's like inherently asking for trouble. So they did change up a lot of that, and we can get to some of this as well. But the lesson here was just that Harman was a big, complex, sophisticated company. Since 2017, it's been a subsidiary of Samsung, one of the largest businesses in the world. And they had, for a long while, they had one sanctions compliance employee trying to keep track of all of this for the whole enterprise. And that's just not adequate. And so here we are.
I was really intrigued. We rarely see enforcement actions where resource allocation is an issue. But when you have one resource allocated to literally a worldwide company, then it becomes an issue. Occasionally we've seen, I think it was Banamex from Citibank had two people to look at thousands of suspicious transaction reports daily. Clearly that wasn't going to happen. But are you reminded of any other significant enforcement actions you can recall where the resources allocated to a particular form of compliance have been so lacking?
Well, you do see that from time to time. Basically, you see it most often, I think, in anti-money laundering cases where you're looking for compliance analysts who might be reviewing suspicious activity alerts. You see that the financial team in question, they've gone from $100 million in assets to $98 zillion in assets. And their compliance team to scan suspicious activity has gone from one person to two, totally inadequate. Now, that is not a new issue in the financial services world. You have occasionally, I don't know, Tom, maybe we've seen it from time to time in FCPA land, although I don't think we've seen it in a while, but certainly I wouldn't be surprised if 10 or 15 years ago that was an issue. Really, what OFAC was getting at here, and I managed to dig up the exact aggravating factors. So they had one senior director of supply chain and global trade compliance. That was the person at Harman responsible for managing U.S. economic sanctions and export controls. Also, they did have in-house attorneys who were trying to provide some backup, but those attorneys did not have the training on OFAC expert compliance. They did not have resources available for sanctions controls and sanctions and export control issues. Neither of those things are easy to deal with under the best of circumstances. But if you really don't know what you're doing, if you're just a general, from central casting corporate lawyer, you could have real struggles there. So I do think we've seen this under-resourced personnel issue before. We've seen it in various ways, but now it looks like maybe OFAC is at least starting to send a signal that it's going to be an issue in sanctions compliance too.
The other thing that intrigued me was we had some significant aggravating factors like actual knowledge. And you pointed out in your blog post that the British sales team had actual knowledge. The sales in question were destined for rain. Yet, even with that aggravating factor, Harman was able to make a comeback. Are we really seeing in action the department's, I guess the Treasury Department's desire for remediation and cooperation that can overcome some pretty serious aggravation?
Well, that's tough for us on the outside to say. I mean, you always have to wonder now with the Trump administration, are they going easy on a company because the company did the right thing? Or are they going easy on the company because the alternative is going tough on a company, which the Trump people are just never going to do, because I don't think they really believe that much in sanctioning corporate misconduct and holding companies accountable. Sanctions is one of the few issues where maybe they are serious about holding companies accountable. So it could be, But frankly, just us on the outside, we should always be aware that we don't know. We don't have too much visibility. We can talk about some of the specific things that Harman did do. So, as I mentioned, they self-disclosed, and we all know that's the golden key to get fair, very favorable treatment from prosecutors now, is to self-disclose violations. A lot of cooperation. They adopted new internal reporting guidelines. They have more autonomy and resources for the Global Trade Compliance Department. I hope that means that senior director now has more staff. The settlement order did say that Harman has agreed to invest $400,000 more in sanctions compliance controls. We don't know what that means. If that's hiring more people, like, I don't think that's what it means, but 400 grand is not a lot, really, to hire more people when you consider how expensive sanctions compliance personnel can be. Maybe it's better technology. They did revamp some of those risk assessment procedures, which I had mentioned before, that the business units were in charge of assessing their own risks and reporting issues to trade compliance teams. I don't think that's the case anymore. I believe, sanctions compliance people are doing that directly. So they are taking some steps. My point is just that the steps that Harman has taken to get here where it is, those are the steps that you should already be doing now, I think, if you're a large corporation, so you will not be on the wrong side of an enforcement action in the future. So, if you are a large business doing a lot of global sales and you have one trade sanctions compliance person, I don't think that's going to cut it if you are a company of Harman's size. If you are letting different business units essentially write their own test and then take it, which is what a sort of self-risk assessment reporting, that's really what it is. That's not going to fly. That's just an invitation for trouble. You can't be doing that anymore. We could definitely, when we pivot to talk about interactive brokers, their issues were more on the technology itself and its misconfiguration. You're not going to be able to get away with that. You're really going to need to have all of your tools working properly. That didn't seem to be as big of a deal with Harman, but a lot of this, with both of these cases, you look at what they have done to improve, that's the floor now for everybody else. You have to have all of these ducks lined up in a row yourself, or else you can wind up going down this path that Harman at Interactive Brokers already did.
Could we pivot over to interactive brokers based on your comment?
Sure. So they are a large equities trading platform, really. And from 2016 clear through until the beginning of 2024. So some of this misconduct at the tail end of it, like, that's recent, man. That's like last week in regulatory enforcement time. They had a poorly working compliance program. And basically, it allowed a long running series of violations to happen. Of what? Like all sorts of stuff. They found that they had allowed business with sanctioned persons who should not have been allowed to trade in U.S. markets. They had violations where the person was permitted to do trading, but not in the security that the person was trading on. So, for example, there was one where the interactive brokers did have the geolocating IP address software to filter out the IP addresses of certain countries. Okay, that's good, but they didn't have it properly configured at all times. So there were occasions where Russian nationals who should have been blocked, they were not blocked. There was another occasion where the geofencing tool did not include Crimea as one of the regions that should have been blocked because Russia had invaded Crimea in 2014 and it should have been blocked and it wasn't blocked. There was another example of a different sort of offense, was that there was a person who wanted to trade in a water treatment company that was in the Xinjiang province of China. Now, the person wanting to do the trading, they were fine, but you are not allowed to trade in that specific water company because it is affiliated with either the Chinese government in Xinjiang or extremist groups over there, but it's on the sanctions list. However, Interactive Brokers' due diligence tool did not catch that until after the trade had happened, which defeats the purpose. So a lot of what was going on with Interactive Brokers was misconfigured tools, technology that's not quite working the way it should have, We don't have too much visibility into why it was misconfigured. Did they have an under-resourced team of people who weren't configuring it correctly? Did they not know what they were doing with the screening tools, which has come up before? And OFAC has expressly warned companies in its guidance for effective sanctions programs. Pay attention to your tools. Pay attention to the screening tools. This is really hard. You need to get that right. And they called that out because it is one of the few elements of a sanctions compliance program that doesn't really exist in the Justice Department's broader guidance for effective compliance programs generally. A lot of what these two say between Treasury with sanctions and the DOJ with ethics and compliance programs overall, there is a lot of overlap, but it's not perfect. And the sanctions tools is one of those issues where Treasury said, no, this is our special thing that we worry about. And we're telling you, this is hard. You have to get it right. And they didn't get it right. And Interactive Brokers was called out for having these low-level problems for roughly 8 years, where the company knew it had these low-level problems, was unable to get them addressed in a timely fashion. And that's the part that stuck in the craw with OFAC for Interactive Brokers, is that there was this long-running awareness of these technical difficulties that were unable to be resolved. And again, why not? Eventually, Interactive Brokers did do a look back at some of its trades, realized it had issues, did everything right from then on, self-reported, good for you, cooperated with OFAC, hooray, did a lot of remediation, but it was still struggling to perfect that remediation on the technical side. And so that wound up becoming an aggravating factor with Interactive Brokers. Interactive Brokers has still also promised that it's going to pour a lot more money into its sanctions compliance program. That is good. That's welcome news. And OFAC did call that out as one of the mitigating factors. But in both of these instances, OFAC had also said, Harman, Interactive Brokers, you guys are both big, sophisticated companies. You know full well you have a lot of sanctions risks, and you should have done better. And you should have done better from the start. That really is the key theme. I would recommend other companies that do have sanctions risk, do a hard look at, well, how big and sophisticated are we? Maybe you're not that big. Maybe you don't have a lot of international trade, and so you don't have to worry about it too much. But clearly, if you are big, if you are international, and you know that this is a thing, OFAC expects you to be aware of it and to address it. As I said, in both of these cases, it's not a lot of money that was involved, particularly with Interactive Brokers. The total amount of dollar volume of the prohibited sanctions, all of this, it was 0.0001 or something like that, like a rounding error, not even a rounding error of money on the total number of transaction volume that Interactive Brokers has done over this period. But 8 years, they knew they had these issues. In 8 years, they were struggling to resolve them, and they didn't. And so that's another interesting case.
Matt, certainly with Harman, I see a clear message, a positive message from OFAC and the Department of Treasury around self-disclosure. I'm struggling a little bit with Interactive Brokers to see or hear, is it a positive message around self-disclosure because of the series of problems they had that lasted for so long? Any thoughts really one way or the other? One or both of these cases move the needle for a compliance professional or board making a decision to self-disclose?
Well, at this point, given that pretty much throughout the Trump administration, and particularly with the Justice Department, they have all said that basically, if you self-disclose and you disgorge any ill-gotten gains, we are going to do everything to make sure this is the most wonderful experience you've ever had. You will get a declination. We're going to guarantee that. You're going to get out of jail free card. You're going to get a new car, all of this stuff. You see that in the speeches all the time. So I think that at this point, you could honestly say self-disclosure is not really going to hurt. On the other hand, the threat that they talk about, which we have not yet seen, but maybe in the fullness of time we will, The threat is that if you don't self-disclose, we are going to also be soliciting whistleblowers left and right. And if we find out about it and we find out you knew and you didn't disclose, then we're going to roast you over the open fire. Now, I'll believe that when I see it, because the department is taking such a flattering and go easy, light touch approach to enforcement. I haven't really seen a hard punch enforcement from this department yet, but this department's only been around 6 months, so we might see it later. But what really jumps out to me about Interactive Brokers, and I do want to call this out, is the amount of remediation they did. So they have spent over $10 million, they say. I'm called up the consent order just now. They're doing all sorts of remedial actions. That includes new screening procedures and controls, the frequency of screening of transactions. They implemented a second-level review process for questionable transactions. They have finally fixed these IP geo-blocking tools, which should have been done like 8 years ago, but whatever, you got it fixed now. They are adding a more risk-based approach to identify sanctions compliance risks. That means more annual risk assessments, things like that. So they are spending quite a bit of cash in absolute terms. In relative terms, probably not. Interactive is a large company, but they really are trying to remake the effectiveness of their sanctions compliance program, the guts of it and the mechanics of how it actually works, as opposed to Harman, which reinvented the personnel side of it. Now, I don't know, maybe Harman has also done a lot on the tech and tool side too. Not too much discussion of that in the Harman order, but there's a lot of talk about the technology, the tools, and the mechanics in the international brokers order. So if you put the two of them together, and I put the two of them together because they came out in less than a week apart, you can start to see this is what would be expected of me, the large, sophisticated global company that does have sanctions compliance risks. This is what OFAC would be expecting my company to be able to do. If you can put these two pieces of consent orders right next to each other and read them out, you'd get a good sense of things.
Well, I think there's some great lessons in both of these cases. I can't wait to see what we come up with next week.
Thank you, Tom.
Compliance Podcast Network. Start your mornings with daily compliance news, quick, sharp updates on the top compliance and ethics stories in under 5 minutes every morning in Compliance Podcast Network. Because compliance never sleeps. Need practical advice fast? Check out Compliance Tip of the Day. One actionable idea to level up your program. Short and sweet, every day on Compliance Podcast Network. Got 10 minutes? We've got the week's top 10 stories. 10 for 10 brings you the big compliance headlines. Fast, fun, and focused. Every Saturday on Compliance Podcast Network. And don't miss the Sunday Book Review, where compliance meets culture through must-read books and big ideas every Sunday in Compliance Podcast Network. Whether you're in the office, on a walk, or commuting, stay smart, stay ethical, stay tuned. Only on the Compliance Podcast Network. Available wherever you listen to podcasts.